Monsters are real, ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. This is a profound statement made by Stephen King, one of the all time best movie producers and directors on this earth, and it epitomizes today's true crime story. Children are supposed to be loving, adorable, innocent, and should be the clay with which society can mold the manner in which we want our future leaders to be. So, what happens when a child, just at the age of 13, sets out on a path to become America's youngest serial killer? Today's true crime story looks at the true crime journey of Craig Price, who has gone into the annals of history as being America's youngest serial killer. And you would find out the extent of his crime, how dastardly and gruesome it was. And you would begin to understand the need for us to take psych evaluations seriously, and also understand that sometimes, just sometimes, a child might pose a threat. So parents also have to take time to study their children carefully and watch what they are exposed to. If you are ready for this ride, buckle up and let's go. Craig Price has two outstanding aliases, the first being the Warwick Slasher and the second being Iron Man. His pathology includes he being a serial killer, he being a family annihilator, he being a robber, and once upon a time, he being a stalker as well. He has claimed 4 lives, assaulted 6 people, and has endeavored in over 4 victimless crimes, and also attempted 1 crime which was not successful. His criminal charges include 4 counts of murder, 1 count of petty theft, 1 count of criminal contempt, 1 count of extortion, and 3 counts of assault. Cumulatively, he has been sentenced to 29 years in prison. Now, this is a tall rap sheet for a child who started killing at the age of just 13 years old. And like I've always been saying, if you want to understand the man, you have to go down to his genesis. So today, we are going to look at the foundation of Craig Price through to how he will metamorphose to what he became and what he is doing to date. So, the story begins in 1974 when Craig Chandler Price was born on October 11th. He and his 2 siblings grew up in Warwick, Rhode Island. Their parents worked a blue-collar job at times when it wasn't common for minorities to hold such positions. So you would actually know that their parents were trying their best to make the best of homes for their kids. Now, Craig's father, called John Price, worked at the local Kmart, and his mother, Shirley, was a clerical worker at the same establishment. It is also important to know that when Craig was younger, his family lived in a city where less than 1% of the total population consisted of African Americans. So obviously, there will be racial tensions. And while these tensions were running high after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, his parents worked hard and overcame significant hurdles to build a stable life for their family. Now, as I was digging into Craig's childhood, most of the things I encountered reported the same information. His childhood was what most people would consider normal. You know that most often, when we are looking at criminals and especially serial killers, if you go down into their childhood, you begin to find that there were things that happened at a point in time in their childhood which may have triggered the onset of whatever tendencies led them to become serial killers. But Craig Price's case is different. His childhood was what most would consider normal. Although there is no such thing as a perfect family, his seemed pretty close. So I couldn't really find any suggestion of abuse or mistreatment. And every article that I read about Craig Price noted that he was a happy child. So you begin to wonder why this thing set in and why he became who he has become. In fact, all of his teachers and neighbors recall that he had a comedic nature about him, and as a child, he would go the extra mile to help others. When any of his neighbors needed a helping hand, Craig was always the first one to arrive. So he was a sweet boy. He was actually a sweet boy at a point in time. He never hesitated to offer his services, whether the task was carrying someone's groceries into the house or mowing their lawn. Craig received good grades in school and he had a passion for football and basketball. And all my research corroborated that Craig was a typical child growing up in the 1970s into the 1980s. Now, this so far suggests that there was nothing triggering what he became, but he was beginning to metamorphose from this point. When Craig was 9 years old, things began to change for him. He was having thoughts about things that were not common for his age. Craig started experiencing disturbingly dark thoughts about death and murder. Some have speculated that these thoughts contributed to his later violence. Now, during my investigation, I found one report which indicated that the police were called to the Price residence after an incident spiraled out of control. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much about that, but police reports did indicate that around this time, Craig started getting in trouble around the neighborhood and soon began to acquire a criminal record. Now, by the time he blew the candles out on his 13th birthday cake, Craig had a litany of charges that included breaking and entering, robbery, stalking, drug use, and assault. Such transgressions are indicative of a boy who is troubled emotionally, a boy who might have suspected his thoughts were unnatural and problematic but didn't know how to ask for help. But then again, I'm not so sure this behavior can be seen as necessarily representing the formative stages of him turning eventually into a violent serial killer. Now, there are plenty of teenagers with similar rap sheets who don't commit monstrous acts. So from that point, it wasn't obvious to determine that Craig was on his path to become a deadly serial killer. Now, despite the darkness in Craig's mind and behavior, the people around him still remembered a cheerful child. Craig seemed like he wanted to do something productive with his life. But at a point in time, sadly, as we have seen a million times, once a person starts making bad choices, they continue to make them, especially if they don't get the help they need, and the darkness within them begins to grow and take them over. Now, Craig fell into this same wrong decision trap when he chose to join a local gang. He also began to experiment with drugs. He started smoking marijuana rather frequently, and it wasn't long before he added LSD to it. Now, LSD, which is a Schedule 1 narcotic, distorts one's perceptions of reality by inducing hallucinations. It is also reported that Craig had a significant growth spurt during this time and was substantially larger and stronger than most boys of his age. If you look at the pictures, he looks more like an 18-year-old. He was really built and he was strong. Now, Craig had a history of stalking women and leering at them through their windows. He also had a history of breaking into people's homes and robbing them. Now, this was the juncture or the point at which he was now escalating from the petty crimes he had been known for to become the brutal murderer that he became. So Craig had a history of stalking women, and this was him now getting into the next phase of his evil evolution. Now, he also had a history of breaking into people's homes and robbing them. But at a point, these two seemingly distinct activities would come together to lead him on to the next stage of his crime life. It should not come as a surprise to anybody that Craig had figured out a way to sneak around yards and homes without drawing attention to himself. So, one of the nights, he was out roaming around the neighborhood, lurking in the shadows, and he found himself outside the home of a neighbor. This neighbor was called Rebecca Spencer. Now, Rebecca lived at 60 Inez Avenue, just a short distance away from Craig's house at 76 Inez Avenue. Rebecca rented the home and was living there with her brother and her two children, who were 8-year-old son and a 4-year-old daughter. Rebecca's lease was due to expire at the end of July 1987, and for weeks she had been preparing for the move. However, with 2 young kids at home, the efforts had been slow going. She told her ex-husband she needed an opportunity to park without the children around to distract her. He decided to help her out, so he began taking the kids with him for whole days so that Rebecca could get the work done. The morning of July 27th, Rebecca's ex-husband picked up the children early, and after they were gone, she enlisted the help of a friend, and the two spent the majority of the morning packing boxes. The two women worked tirelessly throughout the entire day until around 6 p.m. when Rebecca decided to cook some dinner for her friend and her brother. Rebecca's brother worked nights, so when his shift was due, he left the house around 8:30 p.m. and shortly after, his friend's boyfriend came over to help them pack up some more things. When it seemed like they had most of Rebecca's things sealed in moving boxes, the three of them left to go have ice cream and run a few errands. They returned to the house around 11 p.m. and her friends left for the night around midnight. After closing the door behind them on their way out, she went and changed into some pajamas before grabbing a blanket and lying down on the living room floor to watch a little bit of television. It wasn't long before she fell asleep after such a long day of work. But little did Rebecca know that something very evil was actually heading her way in the form of young Craig Price. Unknown to Rebecca, Craig snuck into her house in the wee hours of the morning. That's how he found her asleep on the living room floor, curled up in the blanket. He went into the kitchen where he intended to grab a frying pan. Craig changed his mind about the frying pan when he saw a 10-inch kitchen knife lying on the counter as he walked by. Now, when he returned to the living room, he stood over Rebecca for several minutes, just watching her as she slept. Now, at this point, you begin to wonder what is going on in his mind, standing over her like that. I don't know if it made him feel he's powerful or whatever, but you can see the intense psychopathic tendencies manifesting. Suddenly, without a second thought, he bent down and proceeded to stab her violently. He brutally stabbed her and punctured her heart, liver, lungs, face, and head. A total of 58 stab wounds were inflicted on Rebecca by Craig. When he was finished, he simply stood up and calmly left the house. He went out the back door, snuck over her back fence into her neighbor's yard before heading to his own home. And mind you, at this point, Craig was only 13 years old. Now, since Rebecca was sleeping when Craig stabbed her so viciously, she didn't have a chance to scream. It wouldn't be until the following day, when her brother returned home from work, that people would know anything had ever happened to her. When her brother came in and saw her lying in a pool of blood, he quickly dialed 911. Despite knowing she was already dead, he attempted to perform CPR until the police arrived. And when authorities got to the house, they established the perimeter. They secured it using some crime scene tape before they set about looking for clues as to who could have committed such a horrific crime. They quickly learned there was absolutely no evidence that would lead them to the killer. And as a result of this lack of evidence and no further leads from people nearby, the case grew cold. And I'm sure Craig was excited about this because he felt he has gotten away with it. But as is common of serial killers, once the urge to kill starts, it never dies down. So after brutally murdering Rebecca in her sleep, Craig didn't kill anyone else. He cooled off for a little over 2 years. And during that dormant period, he became a freshman in a high school with a new school and new atmosphere. He had even started to thrive academically. But you see, this is where it gets dangerous. Pick this scenario and try to insert it in your environment wherever you are watching this video. This could be your child's classmate in high school, because at this point, Craig is just 15 years old. But he has killed somebody so violently, and he didn't have any nervous breakdown. He didn't have any emotional breakdown. He's been able to accommodate he committing such a gruesome act, and he's moved on with his life. He could be your child's classmate. Now, however, like I said, as with most serial killers, Craig's urge to kill would return, and he just knew he had to find another victim. So, Craig was on the hunt for his next victim. Now, Joan Heaton married Sergeant John Heaton when she was young, and it wouldn't be long before their family would add more members. Their first daughter, Jennifer, was born in 1979. Then, 2 short years after, they welcomed another daughter they named Melissa. The Heatons appeared to be the ideal family. They spent a lot of time together, sharing laughter and making beautiful memories. That laughter suddenly died on June 19, 1983, when John decided to end his own life. And in 1985, more grief struck the family. So Joan started a new life with her daughters in a new house in a new city. Joan decided on a new neighborhood as an ideal place to start over. But unfortunately for Joan, this new neighborhood that she intended to start over in was actually Craig Price's neighborhood. Craig was only 15 years old at this time when he smoked some marijuana laced with LSD and found himself at Joan Heaton's house. After standing outside for a while, Craig again decided to feed his inner monster. He let himself into the house and headed straight to the kitchen. On the counter, he found a set of kitchen knives that Joan had purchased just earlier that day. According to reports, when Craig entered Joan's house, he made some kind of a noise that woke her up. When she went downstairs to investigate and saw the large teenager in her kitchen, she began to scream. And Craig was afraid one of the neighbors would hear her, so in one long stride, he threw his massive weight against her, strangling her until she slumped to the floor. Once her body fell to the floor, he didn't know if she was unconscious or dead. That's when he decided to stab her. He wound up inflicting 57 stab wounds on the 39-year-old mother of 2. So you again begin to see how merciless this guy is. I don't know if at that time the medical society and the security forces were equipped to enough to determine somebody with a split personality. because going through Craig's case, I felt that maybe he had a split personality, but maybe at that time it was not easy to determine. But it didn't end with Joan. The killing will escalate. When Joan saw Craig and screamed, she had woken up her daughters by so doing. And her daughter, Jennifer, was only 10, and Melissa, her second daughter, was only 8. The girls also came down following they hearing their mother scream, thinking that maybe something might have startled her, and Craig pounced on them and stabbed them as well to death. Craig stabbed Melissa a total of 62 times, and he also stabbed the second daughter a total of 37 times before he would also crush her skull with a stool he found nearby. Now, this guy was just escalating, and I felt that after killing in 2 years ago, where he was 13 years old, and starving himself until the following 2 years, where he was now 15, he had a lot of thirst and hunger inside. And when he saw this family, he saw they were good to feed that hunger, unfortunately. So you begin to wonder what Craig would have gone on to do if he had still been on the streets to this day. And just as he did after killing Rebecca, he snuck through the neighboring yards and made his way back home as though nothing had happened. So when Joan and her daughters moved into their new home, they had this habit of reaching out to their family within some few days intervals. And when they failed to do so in the days that followed, their family knew that it was odd and they decided to follow up. Now, they came in person, and upon arriving at the house, Joan's mother saw what had happened. And because they didn't want to contaminate the crime scene or do anything that may inhibit the police from successfully finding the killer, they immediately called 911 because there was blood everywhere, and with what they saw, there was no need going in to do anything. They needed to preserve the crime scene. Now, they dialed 911 and they exited the house. When the authorities arrived, they taped off the crime scene and watched as fear spread through the neighborhood. Obviously, because imagine that you are staying in this neighborhood, you are a resident of this neighborhood. How would you feel when you wake up and you see that this is what has happened to one of your neighbors and nobody has even been arrested? It means that the perpetrator is actually still on the run. So at that young age, Craig was terrorizing his neighborhood. Now, authorities believed Rebecca was murdered by someone she knew. They figured that since she had only lived in the area for a short time, that was the reason no other attacks would follow. But however, after the brutal slaughter of Joan and her daughters, detectives knew they were now dealing with a serial killer. Here is how they made that determination. Both Rebecca and Joan were single mothers living with their 2 children. Each woman was inflicted with roughly the same number of stab wounds. The stab patterns on both women were also nearly identical. The murder weapons seemed to come from the victims' kitchens. However, the authorities were unable to locate the murder weapons from either crime scene, nor were they able to determine the killer's motivation for committing the murders. Additionally, investigators knew they were only looking for one perpetrator because they saw that the 2 patterns were very similar. So it made more sense that it was one criminal who committed Rebecca's murder 2 years ago and has now committed John's murder 2 years after. But it wasn't enough with this analysis. They needed to bring in the experts because things had escalated out of hand. Detectives who came in knew that if they were going to have a chance at finding the person who murdered these innocent people, they had to enlist the help of others. And the first person they called in was Dr. Henry Lee, the world's foremost forensic scientist who specialized in blood analysis. When Dr. Lee went over the crime scene, he noticed a footprint in the blood. The print belonged to a men's size 13. Since there wasn't anybody in the house who wore that size, the authorities could conclude that the killer let himself in. The second person local authorities called in to help them on the case was Special Agent Greg McCreary from the FBI. Agent McCreary was a profiler and author of the book The Unknown Darkness, Profiling the Predators Among Us. He was able to determine there was a highly frantic nature to the attacks. McCreary told the lead investigators the suspect demonstrated sheer anger and rage while committing the murders. Knowing this, he told them it would most likely mean that it was highly probable that the man they were looking for more than likely had cut himself. So Greg was of the view that looking at the aggression and the anger with which the stab patterns were inflicted on the victims, it's likely that the killer cut himself in the process, maybe through the struggle with John. And that is what made him so angry. The stabbing got more intense. So he told detectives and local authorities that they should be on the lookout for somebody with bandages on his arm or any part of his hand. Now, one day, armed with this, a couple of officers were patrolling the area when they came across Greg hanging out with some friends at the local park. They were well acquainted with the young man as a result of his previous run-ins with authorities, and he was also a regular participant in local police-sponsored youth events. So, I've said this before, the criminals are not like some people who are hiding in a cave somewhere and they only come out at night. They are with us within the day. They are the same people who would see you in the morning and greet you, "Good morning, neighbor, how are you doing? Have a great day." The criminals are the same people who are going to do that with you. So we have to keep an open eye out, and you shouldn't just trust people blindly. You have to take cognizance of the fact that anybody around you could be the next perpetrator. Now, when the two officers saw him, they decided to ask him if he had heard anything about what had happened in the neighborhood. Greg wasn't a suspect. They just knew he was familiar with the streets and wanted to know if there was any chatter about who could have committed the crimes. But the officers were in for a surprise, because when they approached him, they quickly noticed that one of his hands was bandaged. So they asked him what happened, and Craig didn't hesitate to tell them he had drunkenly punched out a car window. They continued to banter back and forth with Craig for a few more minutes before they left and returned to the station. And upon arriving at the station, the officers decided to check reports from the night Craig said he punched out the car window and see if they could corroborate his story. They couldn't find anything to that effect. They also could not determine if the street showed signs of a car window being smashed or broken glass in the middle of the road. Now, with this lack of information to corroborate Craig's claims, it was clear to them he had been less than truthful about how he injured himself. But instead of jumping to conclusions, they decided to pull up his criminal history. His rap sheet indicated the majority of the crimes he had committed were for breaking and entering as well as stalking. Everything they were learning set off some major alarm bells with the two officers. There seemed to be way too many coincidences regarding Craig and what happened to his hand. Although all signs seemed to point at Craig being the suspect in the murders, the officers didn't go to their superiors with the information right away. Obviously, they questioned their suspicions because he would have been only 13 years old at the time Rebecca was murdered, and a 13-year-old child couldn't kill somebody with that much brutality. Or could they? That was what they were thinking. More so, he was also black, so you have to be careful. It would be as though it's a racial profiling. But as luck would have it, one of Craig's friends called them a short time later to tell them how Craig had been bragging about murdering Rebecca and getting away with it. This information gave them what they needed to go to the lead investigators with their suspicions. It happened to be just the information the DA needed to issue the proper search warrant. Now, in the early hours of September 17, 1989, Warwick authorities raided the Price family home. They systematically turned it upside down, looking for any physical evidence to link Craig to the murders. Now, when the young boy woke up to the police searching his parents' house, all he did was crawl back into bed to go back to sleep. The cheek of it, you begin to see that this is someone who thinks he's so wise and he can beat the system. Just when the officers thought they were going to have to leave empty-handed, one of them found something intriguing. He noticed there was a shed in the backyard that still hadn't been searched. Since the warrants covered all structures on the property, a couple of the officers went to check it out. Not long after entering the shed, they located a plastic bag that had been tucked back behind some other objects. When they opened the bag, they found a plethora of blood-soaked items that included knives, clothing, gloves, and other random things. However, the coup de grace was the blood-soaked sock that matched the bloody footprints at the Heaton crime scene. This sock told them they had their man, so to speak, and they promptly placed him under arrest. After the detectives put the handcuffs on Craig and secured him in the back of the squad car, they asked his mother if she wanted to accompany him to the station, and she agreed to go with them. And the entire way there, all she could do was just cry. Craig, on the other hand, seemed utterly detached from the whole situation. He acted as if he were just going for a Sunday drive. Now, once the detectives had Craig in the interrogation room when they got to the police station, they began asking him questions, hoping he would give them a full confession. However, they started the questionings by asking him why he seemed so angry all the time. Craig would eventually imply that he had so much anger due to racism. Racism not only caused his temper to flare, but it was also ultimately what caused the rage inside to grow. It was this growing rage that drove him to commit the murders. He told the detectives that one day he was playing on the street with a group of his friends when a white man called him the N-word. After the man used the derogatory slur against them, he cursed them and he told them to get off the road. Craig said the man's actions made him angry. Craig admitted that he wasn't only mad at the man for making the racial comments, and that he was also mad at himself, probably even more so, for not defending himself or his friends. It didn't take him long to vow to himself that he would get his revenge against the man in question. Craig talked about how he spent the next couple of days watching the man drive by on the streets. He would watch the car every time it pulled in and out of the driveway at Rebecca's house. Apparently, Rebecca's brother Carl was the man driving the vehicle and the man who uttered the racial slur and cursed at Craig and his friends. When the authorities questioned Carl about the incident later, he relayed a different story entirely. He admitted to seeing the boys playing on the street on the day in question, but Carl said he never screamed or cursed at the children. He also adamantly denied ever yelling a racial slur at Craig or anybody else for that matter. So the detectives kept pressing Craig, and after Craig told the detectives about his rage towards Rebecca's brother Carl, he then went on to give his full confession. He claims on the night of Rebecca's murder, He waited until his whole family was in bed asleep before he snuck out of the house. Craig told them he had crept into his neighbor's yard, climbed the fence, and wound up in her yard, only to be disappointed when the car he was looking for wasn't parked in the driveway. When he didn't see the vehicle, he returned home, where he smoked some weed and was more than likely also having to take some LSD as well. After he got high, he decided to sneak back over to the house to see if the car had come back, and even if it hadn't, he would break in and steal some stuff. Upon returning to the yard, he noticed that the television was on. A woman was lying on the floor, covered by a blanket. At that moment, he convinced himself that he would go into the house and kill the woman while she slept. Law enforcement officials know that false confessions are fairly common. So, to determine whether Craig was telling the truth, the detectives asked him what else he remembered from that evening. He recalled boxes in the corner of the room. This was when the authorities knew that he had arrested the right person. Now, when Craig told the detectives about how he had murdered Rebecca, he launched into his confession about killing John and her daughters. He gave precise details about how he had strangled Joan because she had walked in on him soon after entering the house. After Craig described strangling and stabbing Joan, he talked about killing her daughters. He went into vivid details about the girls' screams of terror, their cries as they begged him to stop. Once the detectives were able to get Craig to start talking, they weren't going to do anything to stop him. They could only sit in silence and hang on to Craig's words as he described in vivid, gory detail the murders he had committed. When he finally was done talking, the detectives had more than enough information to charge him with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of burglary. On the day he was arrested, Craig was just shy of his 16th birthday. Now, in 1989, Craig had now been arrested for the murders, and it was against the laws of the American criminal justice system for prison services to incarcerate juvenile offenders past their 21st birthday. Therefore, this was going to be a tricky situation because Craig was now 15 years old, heading into 16 years old. Therefore, when Craig was found guilty on the murder charges, he was only sentenced to serve 5 to 6 years in a juvenile facility. If he had been an adult when he committed the murders, he would have received a mandatory life sentence. Now, the laws on young offenders in 1989 ensured that after Craig served the 5 to 6 years, he would get released and his criminal record would be sealed. However, Craig's actions after he was sentenced prompted people to take the necessary steps needed to make changes to the system. So, on September 21st, 1989, Craig pleaded guilty to his charges and he was transferred to another facility. But while he was in this other facility, Craig was ordered to undergo psychological therapy and examinations to determine a proper course of action needed to rehabilitate him. Craig, however, wasn't willing to comply. He absolutely refused to submit to any and all attempts health and prison officials made to engage him in the mandatory treatment and therapy. Thus, he has remained untreated. Not long after Craig received his sentence for the murders, people realized that teenagers were just as capable of committing horrific crimes as adults were, and the public outrage over Craig's seemingly lenient sentence as a violent offender due to his age was enough for people to demand a legislation to prevent him from being released after 5 to 6 years, which seemed so short. And I agree. You can't do all this and just take 5 to 6 years. It's like having a slap at the back of your hand. So in 1990, the citizens of Rhode Island would start to see changes being made in the juvenile justice system. the Assistant Attorney General, and Kevin Collins, Warwick Police Detective, would join forces to help pass some of these laws, and the pair were instrumental in passing the O'Neill Bill, which would harden sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders. Unfortunately, their strenuous efforts would not be sufficient to keep Craig behind bars past his 21st birthday. Pine didn't want to feel as if he failed the citizens of his great state of Rhode Island. He decided the best way to understand an offender like Craig would be to learn from the people who dedicated their lives to apprehend him. He therefore traveled to Quantico to attend training courses led by the FBI. While taking these courses, Pine learned fewer than 1% of killers who are frenzied during the commission of their crimes in the same way that Craig was. He also discovered that there wasn't a practical way to treat this type of offender to ensure they do not re-offend. Pine took the information he gathered from the courses at Quantico back to courts in Rhode Island to get their help. He then petitioned the courts to issue an order that would mandate Craig to undergo psychological testing and any pursuant therapy associated with those test results. Even with this court order, Craig openly refused to participate. His blatant refusal allowed Pine to file contempt of court charges against Craig in 1994. Now, I admire the dedication of Pine. This is someone who is bent on ensuring that he's making his society safe. You can see that he is not just enjoying the perks that come with his office, but he's actually breaking his back to put in the work to make sure that he is giving his constituents all that he owes them by virtue of he occupying that office. While Craig was in court facing the contempt charges, he publicly lashed out, threatening to kill a correctional officer. And considering that he was a convicted murderer who openly threatened to murder again, he was found guilty of the contempt charges and sentenced to serve an additional 15 years, with 8 suspended. With his behavior, Craig himself guaranteed he would remain incarcerated past his 21st birthday. However, is there anything else we can expect from his cases? So, Craig's violent behavior has only escalated since he has been incarcerated. And like I told you, if he did all these things by the age of 15, this was he just starting. So he was definitely going to do worse as he grew if he didn't get the help that would solve his problem. Now, Craig's violent behavior had only escalated at this point. And since 1996, he has succeeded in adding more time to his original 5 to 6 years and the additional 15 years he received from the contempt of court charges. Now, this is a chronological outline of the charges that he has added. Craig received 1 additional year for biting the finger of an officer. That was in 1996. Now, in 1997, Craig was charged with contempt for again not complying with the psychological mandates ordered by the court. He was again found guilty and received an additional 25 years, with 15 years suspended. 1999 to 2001, Craig verbally and physically attacked another officer and received 4 additional years to his sentence. 2017, Craig attacked fellow inmate Joshua Davis with a shank and received 25 additional years. As at last year 2022, before the incident in 2017, Craig Price's earliest parole hearing would have been February 2022. Unfortunately, now that he has received the additional 25 years, it's largely believed that Craig will never see freedom again in his life. So, it's a tall rap sheet. In some ways, it's a bit sad. I feel sad for Craig in a way. At the point of he being a kid at the time these things started, I don't know if what he attributes it to is what it was, whether he got this anger from being racially profiled and it sent him down that path. If it's true, then it's more like a nature sort of thing. He might be a product of his environment as it was at that time. This is not to excuse the crimes that he would commit. And I feel even more sad for the families of these victims and the victims themselves. But I think that if what Craig said is true, then we should all see how we can live together in peace as a society. Because if you put someone down, if you trod on someone's joy and happiness, for all you know, you could be creating the next serial killer that may come after someone you love. Let's all work together to make the world a better place. Now, do you feel that Craig Price's criminal behavior is as a result of nature? And are the courts justified in mandating Craig Price to undergo psychological testing and therapy? I think they are, but let me know what your views are. And what else do you think can be done right to avoid some of these things from recurring? But like I would always say, stay safe out there, keep an eye out. The people who commit these crimes are with us. We are with them every day. They are people we know. They are people who smile to us. So don't reside with the thinking that where you are and the people that you interact with are not capable of some of these things. Granted, some of them may not be capable, but most often, at least, there's someone who might be. Tread cautiously, treat people nicely, stay safe out there. Subscribe to the channel if you already haven't. Thank you for sticking with us to this point. Turn on post notifications, share our content with someone, leave a comment, give us feedback. We would love to hear from you. Catch you another time.